Welcome. This time, we'll explore the deadly potions and powders that people in the Middle Ages once trusted. Some promised healing, others promised visions, but many gave only a slow and certain end. Let's take a look. You're here now, not in some royal hall, not in a scholar's study, but in the corner of a tavern so thick with smoke it feels like you're breathing through cloth. And tonight, we'll take you slowly through the things they swallowed, sipped, and smoked in the Middle Ages. The things that warmed the blood, blurred the edges, and sometimes carried people further than they ever meant to go. Start with the tavern, because that's where most nights begin. The ale is cheap, the benches are uneven, and the air smells of wet wool and ash. In the far corner, a group of men lean over a clay jug. The wine inside is warm, heavy, sweetened just enough to hide the bitterness of the dark resin they're stirring in. Opium, traded from far-off markets, carried on ships alongside silks and spices, worth more than most will see in a month. For the rich, it's a luxury. They buy it in larger lumps, roll it between their fingers, talk about Eastern wonders, while a servant keeps their cup full. For them, it's an indulgence, a night's entertainment, like a lute player's song or a new fur. For the poor, it's stolen in crumbs, a sliver begged from a sailor, or bought with the last copper meant for bread. They stretch it by stirring it into ale so weak it tastes mostly of water, but it's enough. Enough to make the ache soften, to let the mind drift somewhere beyond the cold walls of the tavern. Prices shift with the season. After a storm at sea, when ships limp into port with half their cargo ruined, a small ball of opium can cost as much as a week's rent. In the flush of summer trade, when the docks groan under the weight of goods, even a fisherman might scrape together enough for one slow night. It doesn't take much to see why they come back for it. The fire in the hearth seems to burn brighter. The songs, even the ones you've heard 100 times, sound warmer, closer. Time slides. The arguments at the next table fade to a distant hum. You forget the damp in your boots, the sore in your shoulder, the debt waiting at home. But there are the other nights, too. The ones where a man leans too far back on the bench and doesn't rise again. Where the laughter slows into silence, and the tavern keeper's eyes shift to the door, not wanting trouble. Opium is a gentle thief. It steals in small measures, until one night it takes everything at once. In towns where the church keeps a tighter grip, there are warnings. Sermons about the devil's resin, about the souls lost in smoky corners. But even there, the trade doesn't stop, it just moves. Back rooms, shuttered windows, coins passed in the palm. And so, whether in the open hum of a port tavern or the dim hush of a back alley room, the story begins here. With the warm cup, the dark resin, and the choice to forget the world for a while. And if the taverns of inland towns were heavy with wine and the resin of opium, the ports were something else entirely. Here, the air tasted of salt before you even saw the sea, and the streets ran with the smell of fish, tar, and warm bread. The ships brought everything: barrels of dried figs, bolts of dyed cloth, amphorae of oil. But they also brought parcels wrapped in coarse linen and tied with twine. Inside those parcels was hashish. It came from far east of here, where the sun burned hotter and the nights were thick with music. Sailors brought it not as a secret, but as a prize. They would unwrap it in the open, the green-brown blocks breaking under their fingers, releasing a smell that was part earth, part spice, part something almost sweet. The feast began after the day's catch was sold. Coins in their pockets, men would gather in the yards between the docks and the warehouses, the wood still warm from the sun. A table might be set with bread, olives, cheese, whatever was cheapest that day. The hashish was the centerpiece. It wasn't smoked here, not yet, not often. It was eaten in small pieces, pressed into dates or mixed with honey to mask its bitterness. You'd take a bite, chase it with a sip of wine, and wait. Slowly, The voices around you would sound as though they were speaking from inside a dream. The seas slap against the hulls would turn rhythmic, like a drum. Someone would start a song, and it would stretch longer than it should, each note clinging in the warm air. The rich had their own version. In the private rooms of portside inns, hashish was served with roasted meat, figs dripping with honey, and goblets of the finest imported wine. For them, it was indulgence layered on indulgence. The substance itself was not enough, it had to be dressed in luxury. For the poor, it was an escape worth chasing, even at the cost of hunger. Sailors sometimes traded crumbs for labor, an hour unloading barrels, and you might walk away with enough to share among 3 friends. Others pawned a tool or a pair of boots for the chance to spend a single evening in that slow, golden fog. The trouble with hashish was not in the night itself. It was in the day after. The mornings came late, sluggish, with a heaviness in the limbs that no amount of cold water could wash away. Work slowed, nets came back lighter, goods were carried less carefully. The harbor masters noticed, the priests noticed, but the trade did not stop. In some towns, it was part of the rhythm of the port. The arrival of a ship meant not just goods, but a feast that might last 2 nights. In others, it moved quietly, kept to small circles who met in the same rooms, at the same tables, under the same lamps, year after year. And for all the warnings, the sermons, the fines, the whispered stories of men lost in the haze, the smell of it still clung to the docks. It mingled with the salt and the tar, a faint sweetness that told you something was happening, somewhere just out of sight. So if the tavern was the start of the road, the port was where the world's farthest corners met, and hashish was one of the ways they spoke to each other, without needing to share a language. If the ports gave you hashish wrapped in linen and warm honey, the cities inland offered something stranger, and far more dangerous. You would not find it on the table of a dockside feast, nor traded openly in the marketplace. Belladonna, the deadly nightshade, was a whisper rather than a shout, passed hand to hand like a secret too precious, or too foolish, to speak aloud. It grew in the shadows of hedgerows and forest edges, its black berries glossy as drops of ink. The plant was known to heal in the right hands and kill in the wrong ones, and in the Middle Ages, those hands were often the same. Apothecaries, herbalists, and certain women with gardens no priest dared to bless all knew how to coax its essence into a drink. The method was as simple as it was lethal. Drops of belladonna tincture, just enough to sharpen the world without tipping it into darkness. Too much, and the heart faltered. Too little, and you might as well be drinking plain wine. The ones who used it spoke of colors deepening, of music thickening until it seemed to hum inside their bones. The edges of faces softened, the candlelight bloomed wider, and the body felt both light and unsteady, as if walking on a moving floor. The rich drank it in private, the goblets etched with silver, and the servants warned to watch the poor carefully. A banquet might end with wine touched with nightshade, each guest taking a sip and pretending they were not watching the others for the first signs, the slower blink, the softened gaze, the smile that lingered too long. For them, it was another way to stand on the edge without falling, to taste the forbidden without fully paying for it. For the poor, it was more reckless. There was no silver goblet, no careful servant counting drops. It was an herb bought from someone who knew someone, measured with the eye, mixed into ale until the bitter taste could be half forgotten. They drank it for courage, for pleasure, for the strange feeling that came just before the dizziness, the sense that the night could go on forever. It had its dangers, and everyone knew them. There were stories of men found at dawn, smiling faintly as if still in the middle of a toast. Of women who had been laughing one moment and gone the next, their hearts stopping as softly as a candle flame going out. Priests called it a sin, healers called it foolish, and still, it was passed around at gatherings where the air was thick with smoke and daring, a few used it for other purposes. A lover's drink laced with nightshade could soften the mind enough to make a yes easier to hear. A rival's cup made just a touch too strong could end a dispute without a mark left behind. It was pleasure and weapon both, depending on the hand that poured. The price of belladonna varied wildly. In the garden of someone who knew the plant, it cost nothing but the risk of being caught picking it. In the shop of an apothecary, it might cost as much as a week's food, a price paid in coin or in whatever the seller wanted more than coin. Those who couldn't pay stole it, and those who couldn't steal waited for someone else to drink too much and left their cup unattended. And always there was the fine line, the razor edge between the glow and the grave. No one ever truly knew how close they stood to it until they crossed it. Some claimed that was the point, to drink knowing that every swallow might be the one that tilted the balance. From the sharp, dangerous heat of belladonna, the path leads to another plant with a reputation no less unsettling, the mandrake. You might hear of it first not in a market or a tavern, but in a low, amused tone from someone leaning too close, as if the word itself were something to be kept behind closed doors. It grew in awkward shapes, the roots splitting into two prongs like a pair of twisted legs. Some swore it looked like a tiny human, its limbs curled, its head knotted with threads of fine root hairs. This was enough for the superstitions to flourish, that the plant screamed when pulled from the earth, that its cry could kill a man, that it needed to be harvested at night with careful rituals, sometimes by tying it to an animal to pull it free. What mattered most to those who sought it, though, was what it could stir in the body. Powdered fine and slipped into ale, mandrake was said to quicken the pulse, warm the skin, make the blood move faster. For lovers, it was a way to heighten a night. For those seeking advantage, it was a way to bend desire to their will. Among the wealthy, mandrake appeared at feasts that began in formality and ended in abandon. A goblet passed to the right person, a toast made with a knowing smile, and soon the edges between restraint and indulgence began to fray. The musicians played longer, the wine flowed faster, and the air in the hall thickened with heat and laughter. Among the poor, it was rarer, harder to find. An apothecary might sell a pinch for more coin than most could spare, or it might be traded for in other ways, a favor, a secret, a piece of labor owed. The plant could be found in the wild, but harvesting it was dangerous in more ways than one. Even if you did not believe in the deadly scream, there was still the matter of getting enough root to matter without being seen and accused of witchcraft. The risks were real. Too much mandrake and the warmth it promised became a fire that could not be put out. The heart raced too quickly, the breath grew shallow, the world tilted on its axis. There were stories of men found in doorways, eyes wide but empty, the goblets still in their hand. Of women whose laughter had turned to silence mid-song. And yet, desire was a powerful currency, and many were willing to gamble with it. In certain houses, especially those that kept their own gardens, mandrake was used carefully, its effects portioned out like a rare spice. A client who drank it might spend more freely, linger longer, believe the night more vivid than it truly was. There was also the matter of belief, and belief could be as potent as the plant itself. A man convinced he had tasted mandrake might act the part its reputation demanded, even if the cup he held was nothing more than spice wine. The plant's danger lay as much in the mind as in the body. It was not a common indulgence, and that made it all the more alluring. To be offered mandrake was to be marked as someone worth the risk, or worth the trouble. And whether in a candlelit hall or a darkened back room, the one who drank it stepped into a space where pleasure and peril stood side by side, each watching the other closely. After the whispered dangers of roots and berries, there is comfort in something golden and familiar, or at least it seems so at first. Mead, the drink of honey and water left to ferment until it could outmatch wine in strength, was the pride of many a feast. Sweet on the tongue, heavy in the stomach, it was the one indulgence no one needed to whisper about. It flowed most freely on festival days. The long tables groaned under platters of bread and roasted meat, but it was the mead that bound the guests together. In the great halls of kings and jarls, the drink was poured into goblets of silver or horn carved with patterns older than the hall itself. The first cups were raised with toasts to the gods, to victory, to long life. By the third or fourth, the toasts became looser, the voices louder, the hands less steady. For the rich, mead was brewed strong and stored long, its sweetness deepened, its bite hidden under layers of warmth. It was not uncommon for a king to stagger by the end of a feast, smiling broadly, his crown slightly askew, while the court pretended not to notice. The drink had a way of loosening more than tongues. Secrets were traded, promises made that could not survive the morning. Among the poor, mead was lighter, brewed quickly with whatever honey could be spared. It was often cloudy, less sweet, sometimes sour if the ferment ran too long. But even this humbler version could send a man to his bed too soon or keep him from rising when the day's work called. At weddings, it was drunk until the bride and groom were as unsteady as their guests. At wakes, it was drunk until grief dulled to something more bearable. The price of honey made strong mead a luxury, but for special occasions, people would trade a week's worth of food for enough to fill a jug. Beekeepers, knowing their worth, sometimes set aside the best of their harvest not for the market, but for certain buyers whose coin was always ready. In the wrong hands, mead could be as dangerous as any herb. Its sweetness disguised its power, and the drinker might not feel the weight of it until it was too late. Fights broke out at feasts over nothing more than a careless word. More than one noble's downfall began with a decision made at the height of mead's warmth. Still, it remained a drink of joy. When the hall was lit with torches, the air thick with music and the smell of roasting meat, the golden drink passed from hand to hand felt like the very heart of the celebration. Even those who woke the next day with throbbing heads and bruised pride rarely swore it off entirely. From the golden sweetness of mead, we step into something darker, an ale with a bitter edge and a reputation for turning a man into someone even his closest friends might not recognize. Henbane, with its pale yellow flowers veined like a map of fevered dreams, was not a plant for the careless. It was easy enough to grow, too easy, in fact, and its seeds and leaves found their way into the brewing vats of those who wanted more than a simple drink. A pinch of henbane added to ale gave it a strange, heady kick, heavier than any amount of barley or hops could manage. It loosened the tongue, yes, but it also rattled the mind, tilting the world at a strange angle. The rich rarely touched it. Henbane ale was a working man's indulgence, brewed in small batches in the back rooms of rural inns or on the hearths of households looking to make extra coin. It was cheaper than mead, stronger than common ale, and far more unpredictable. 1 cup might make you sing, 2 might make you stagger, and 3 could leave you waking in a ditch with no memory of how you got there. Among laborers, it was a drink for nights when there was something to forget, a bad harvest, a lost wager, a wound that still ached when the weather turned. It brought a quick, reckless kind of cheer, the sort that turned games of dice into brawls and quiet talk into shouting matches. The mad drunk was not just a name, it was a warning. Those who drank too much henbane ale could rage like men possessed, their eyes glassy, their strength unnervingly sharp. It had other uses, whispered about but rarely admitted. A man hoping to get the better of a rival might buy him a round, laced with just enough henbane to cloud his judgment. A woman might slip it into a husband's cup if she wanted him too dazed to notice her slipping away for the evening. The plant's effects were unpredictable enough that anything done under its haze could be blamed on the drink, and often was. The price was low, but so was the safety. Brewers who misjudged the amount risked killing their customers, and there were stories of entire tables laid low by a single overstrong batch. In some towns, priests tried to ban its use, declaring it a poison. In others, it was simply another part of the night's offerings, its dangers shrugged off as the drinker's own choice. The mornings after were their own punishment. Henbane left the body hollowed out, the head thick and aching, the stomach raw. Some swore the dreams it brought were worse, vivid, twisted visions that clung to the edges of waking, making the day feel as unsteady as the night before. And yet, for all its risks, it endured. In the dim corners of alehouses, the smell of it, sharp, earthy, tinged with something faintly sweet, signaled a night that could end in laughter or in blood. Those who drank it knew the gamble, and many were drawn to it for that very reason. After the wild, unsteady haze of henbane ale, there is something quieter, slower, and in its own way, far more seductive. Poppy syrup did not shout, it whispered. It began as medicine. The poppy was boiled down, its milky sap drawn out and thickened into a dark, sticky syrup. Mixed with honey or wine, it dulled pain like nothing else could. Broken bones, rotting teeth, the fever pains that bent the body double, all were softened beneath its weight. For the healer, it was a gift, for the patient, it was a blessing. But blessings are rarely free. Those who took poppy syrup to survive a wound sometimes kept taking it long after the wound had healed. A spoonful at night brought warmth to the limbs, slowed the thoughts, wrapped the world in a soft haze where sharp edges couldn't reach. It was comfort made liquid. And once you'd grown used to it, the nights without it felt colder, harder, longer. The rich kept it in glass bottles, stoppered tight, the syrup glinting dark as blood under candlelight. They would call for it when the weather turned, when their bones ached, or when they simply wished to sleep without dreams. The poor, if they could get it at all, bought it in clay pots no bigger than a thumb, or in vials wrapped in cloth, bought from traveling sellers who never stayed long enough for complaints to catch up to them. The price was high. A measure of syrup could cost more than a week's worth of bread, and healers who made it well guarded their methods closely. In some towns, the poppy fields were watched as closely as the granaries, and theft from them carried the same penalties. People found ways to stretch it. Watered down, mixed with cheap ale, or even scraped thin with a knife and stirred into warm broth, it could still bring a little of the calm, enough to take the edge off. Some households pooled their coins to buy a single small jar, shared between them when the nights grew unbearable. The dangers were quieter than with henbane or belladonna, but no less real. Too much syrup slowed the breath, made the body heavy, the mind wander in circles until it forgot how to return. There were mornings when a bed was found cold, the jar empty, the spoons still lying beside it. Yet the syrup's pull was strong. Pain was constant in the Middle Ages, from work, from illness, from hunger. Anything that eased it, even for a few hours, was hard to refuse. And so the jars kept changing hands, the spoons kept dipping in, and the nights kept passing in that slow, sweet drift between waking and sleep. It was not a drink for laughter or for brawls. It was for the quiet hours, the ones when the fire was low and the door was barred, when there was nothing to do but wait for morning and hope it came gently. If poppy syrup wrapped the world in a slow, heavy warmth, Datura promised something stranger, not comfort, but escape. Not just from pain or sorrow, but from the ground itself. You wouldn't find it in the marketplace under its name. In some towns, the plant was called moonflower, in others, devil's trumpet. Its pale blossoms opened in the evening, releasing a sweet, almost intoxicating scent. But the real magic, or poison, depending on who you asked, was in its seeds and leaves. Mixed carefully into animal fat, datura became part of what some called a flying ointment. The recipe shifted from village to village, but the idea remained the same: rub it into the skin, and the mind would take flight, leaving the body behind. It was not for the faint-hearted. Too much could stop the heart, too little and nothing happened at all. Those who made it claimed they could measure the right dose by sight and smell, though even they sometimes got it wrong. The ointment was rubbed into the temples, the wrists, the inside of the thighs, anywhere the skin was thin and the blood close. The sensations came slowly at first. A warmth, a heaviness in the limbs, a ringing in the ears like distant bells. Then the room would begin to shift, as if it were tilting, as if the air itself had grown thick enough to swim in. Some swore they saw their own bodies from above. Others spoke of traveling to far-off places, to forests and mountains, and seas they had never touched in waking life. Among the wealthy, such things were curiosities. A noble might try it once at the urging of a physician alchemist, seeking visions or strange dreams to boast of later. But among the poor, and especially among those on the fringes of society, flying ointments carried deeper meaning. They could be a form of rebellion, of claiming freedom in a life where movement was otherwise limited to a few dusty roads and the space between the fields and the church. The church, of course, saw something else in it. Datura and the ointments it fed became tied to stories of witchcraft, of secret meetings and pacts with the devil. Whether or not those stories were true mattered less than the fear they spread. Being caught with the plant could be enough to draw suspicion. Being caught with the ointment was worse. Still, it did not disappear. It moved quietly, from hand to hand, made in kitchens by lamplight, stored in jars tucked behind flour sacks or under loose floorboards. Payment was not always in coin. Sometimes it was in food, in labor, in protection. The visions it brought were not always kind. Some saw wonders, soaring over fields, walking through markets where every face was a friend's, touching the edges of the sea. Others found themselves trapped in strange, shifting landscapes where nothing was solid, where voices whispered from the dark, where time folded back on itself until it was impossible to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. The mornings after were quiet, heavy. Limbs ached, heads pounded, and the memory of flying often blurred into fragments, as if trying to recall a dream. And yet, for those who had felt it once, the pull to try again was strong. It was a dangerous freedom, yes. But in a world where most never saw beyond the edge of their own village, the chance to leave the ground, even only in the mind, was worth almost any risk. From the strange ointments that promised to lift you above the ground, we come crashing back to earth, to the most ordinary food on the medieval table, bread. Yet even bread could betray you. Rye was common in many regions, especially where wheat was too dear or too delicate for the climate. It was a hardy grain, able to grow where little else could. But rye had a shadow, a fungus called ergot, which appeared as dark, horn-shaped growths among the kernels. In small amounts, it might pass unnoticed. In larger doses, it turned a staple into a slow-burning poison. No one set out to eat ergot. It came in the damp years, when the harvests rotted on the stalk, or when grain stores grew musty in the heat. Poorer households could not afford to throw away a spoiled sack. The bread had to be baked, no matter how it smelled or looked. Hunger outweighed caution. The effects came slowly at first. A tingling in the fingertips. A heat in the veins, as though the body were burning from the inside. Then came the cramps, twisting muscles until hands curled into claws and feet turned inward. For some, there were visions, saints or demons, fields of impossible color, voices calling from far beyond the room. Others felt as if insects were crawling beneath their skin, scratching and biting where no hand could reach. Among the poor, ergot outbreaks could sweep through entire villages. In some places it was called the fire, in others, St. Anthony's curse. Priests would lead processions, praying for the burning to stop, but prayer did little when the bread itself was the enemy. The wealthy suffered less often. They could afford to discard suspect grain, to buy wheat from regions spared by damp or rot. Still, even a noble table was not entirely safe. A single bad shipment from a distant estate could bring the fire to the most gilded hall. There were healers who claimed to know how to purge it: bitter teas, fasting, cold baths to draw the heat from the body. Most of these did nothing but exhaust the sufferer further. The only true cure was to stop eating the bread, but in years of scarcity, that was no cure at all. And so the same loaf that had been prayed over in the morning could bring fever by night. Families watched each other closely at the table, noting who winced, who shifted their weight as if to ease a sudden cramp. The smell of rye, once comforting, could become a warning. Some whispered that the visions it brought were gifts, prophecies, messages from the divine. Others said they were temptations, meant to draw the soul away from salvation. Whatever the truth, the fire in the veins was as feared as it was inescapable in bad years. In the end, bread remained on the table because it had to. Hunger was the sharper blade, and people learned to live with the risk. But the memory of the fire lingered, long after the grain stores were clean again, a quiet fear in every bite. After the bitter taste of rye that could burn a body from within, imagine a cup of wine fragrant with spices brought from lands most would never see. Ginger, sharp and warming. Clove, dark and sweet with a bite that lingers on the tongue. For the rich, these were not medicines or poisons in disguise, they were proof of wealth. Spices traveled farther than most men ever dreamed of going. They crossed deserts on camelback, floated in the holds of ships that smelled of salt and tar, and passed through hands that counted each measure as if it were gold. By the time they reached a noble's table, their price had multiplied many times over. To drink wine steeped with ginger or clove was to drink the world itself, the far-off markets of Alexandria, the crowded spice stalls of Constantinople, the monsoon winds that carried ships from India. In the great halls, such drinks were served at feasts and special councils, poured from silver ewers into goblets chased with precious metal. The flavor was more than taste. It was warmth that spread from the tongue to the chest, a comfort on cold nights in draughty stone halls. Ginger was said to strengthen the stomach, clove to sweeten the breath and the temper. In a time when most food was plain, these scents and tastes were almost overwhelming. For the poor, such spices were nearly mythical. A few might catch a whiff from the kitchens of the wealthy, carried on the night air when the shutters were open. Sometimes a traveling merchant would bring a handful to market, selling by the smallest pinch, just enough to flavor a single meal. Even then, it cost more than most could spare. The rich used spices lavishly when they wished to impress, a mark not only of their coin, but of their reach. To serve gingered wine to a guest was to tell them that nothing was too far, too rare, too costly. At weddings, the spiced drinks might flow freely, filling the hall with their perfume. At midwinter feasts, they were a promise that the cold could be held at bay, at least for a night. But like all luxuries, spices had their politics. Controlling the trade meant controlling who could drink such warmth and who could not. Ports were watched, routes guarded, prices manipulated. Wars had been fought over such things, though in the quiet glow of a noble's hall, that truth was easy to forget. There were whispers, too, of less noble uses. Ginger could be mixed with stronger powders to disguise their bitterness. Clove could hide the taste of wine that had gone sour. A guest might drink deeply, never knowing their cup carried more than simple spice. Still, for most who could afford them, these were pleasures unshadowed. A cup of spiced wine was a comfort after the hunt, a mark of celebration after a treaty signed, a toast to a marriage or a victory. The fire in the veins it brought was not the cruel burn of ergot, but a steady, warming glow that made the hall feel safer than it truly was. And for those who could only dream of it, the scent alone was enough to linger in memory, a reminder that somewhere, behind thick walls and guarded doors, people drank the far-off world in deep, slow sips. From the soft, sweet perfume of ginger and clove, the path turns towards something harsher, a drink for those who value bite over comfort. Wormwood, bitter and green, with leaves like fine lace and a smell that clung to the fingers. It was said to sharpen the mind, to clear the fog, to steady the thoughts of men who needed to decide quickly and act without doubt. The wine was steeped with the herb until it turned a shade darker, its fragrance sharper, almost metallic. The first sip was enough to curl the tongue, to bring water to the eyes. It was not a drink you swallowed carelessly. To take it was a choice, an admission that you wanted not warmth, but clarity. Among the learned, scholars, physicians, certain priests, wormwood wine had a place beside parchment and ink. A cup taken before study was believed to keep the mind from wandering, to burn away distraction like a torch chasing shadows. Some alchemists swore by it, claiming their best work was done under its bitter influence. Soldiers drank it too, before councils of war, believing it lent them quickness in thought and certainty in speech. Captains kept it in narrow-necked flasks, sipping sparingly, as if too much might burn not only the fog but the very thoughts themselves. The poor rarely sought it out for pleasure. Its bitterness was too strong, its price too high, and its effects too unpredictable. But it was sometimes taken as medicine, to rouse a dull stomach, to chase away a lingering chill. In some villages, a healer might pour a small measure for a laborer who had grown slow and tired after a long sickness, warning him to sip and not gulp. There was danger in ignoring that warning. Too much wormwood brought not clarity but visions, fleeting shapes at the edge of sight, voices speaking from nowhere. A mind sharpened too far could begin to cut itself. Some never came back from that edge, left with a gaze that drifted over friends and family, as if looking at strangers. Its price lay between common wine and the spiced luxuries of the rich. Enough for a bottle could buy a week's worth of rye bread, and the best wormwood came from hillsides where the soil was thin and the sun fierce, places that grew little else. Traders carried it in bundles, dried and wrapped, to be steeped fresh on arrival. In the right amount, it worked as promised. A sluggish morning could turn to a clear afternoon. A weary soldier could find new energy for the march. But its bitterness lingered, coating the tongue, rising in the breath for hours afterward. You carried it with you, even after the cup was drained. It was a drink for those who wanted to be awake in every sense, who believed there was strength in seeing the world without softness. And sometimes, in the quiet between tasks, that sharpness was exactly what they feared most. From the sharp taste of wormwood that promised a clearer mind, we moved to something far more dangerous, and far more vain. Arsenic, white as ground bone, smooth as sifted flour. Not taken for healing, not for clarity, but for beauty. It was said that a tiny dose could brighten the eyes, smooth the skin, and lend the cheeks a faint, healthy color. In an age where the sun and wind carved their marks deep into faces, such promises were powerful. The white powder was mixed into water or wine, swallowed in sips by those who believed they could control its hunger. Among the wealthy, arsenic was measured with delicate spoons, kept in small jars of glass or ivory, sometimes locked away like treasure. Ladies of court would take it in the morning before their mirrors, studying the slow change in their reflection as though watching a garden bloom. Servants whispered about the price, not in coin, but in years stolen quietly, one sip at a time. The poor almost never touched it. The cost was too high, and the danger too plain. But there were exceptions, a bride wanting to look her best on her wedding day, a performer seeking to hold an audience's gaze a little longer, a merchant's daughter trying to catch the notice of someone far above her station. For them, a single dose might be bought in secret, paid for with savings meant for food or firewood. The results were real enough, at first. Skin paled and smoothed, eyes seemed brighter, hair shone more in the light. But the change came with a cost that no one could truly hide. The stomach turned delicate, refusing food. A faint metallic taste lingered on the tongue. The body grew weaker, the breath shorter. Some tried to stop before the damage set in, but by then, the habit, or the fear of losing what beauty they'd gained, kept the cup in their hand. In certain courts, it became almost an unspoken requirement. To look pale and flawless was to show that you could afford the powder, that you could take the risk. The ideal face was not one of health, but of refinement, and refinement, it seemed, could be brewed from poison. There were stories of women who had taken it for years, their beauty untouched by age until, quite suddenly, it was gone. Death came not with drama, but with a quiet collapse, a final sip swallowed without knowing it was the last. Physicians warned against it, of course. They spoke of the slow rot it brought to the inside of the body, of the way it thinned the blood and weakened the heart. But warnings could not compete with the mirror's promise. In the dim light of a chamber, with the scent of lavender on the air, and the quiet rustle of silk, arsenic looked harmless enough. Just a pinch of white dust in a cup of wine. Just a moment's choice in a lifetime of them. And for many, that choice was worth more than the years it would take away. From the pale sheen of arsenic in the cup, we moved to something brighter, almost beautiful to look at, if you didn't know what it could do. Mercury, quicksilver, the liquid metal that rolled like drops of mirror across the table. It caught the light in a way nothing else could, a shifting, living silver that seemed too strange to be entirely of this world. Physicians swore by it for certain ailments, most of all the ones people feared to name aloud. Poured into wooden spoons or mixed into ointments, mercury was said to draw sickness out of the body, to chase it from the blood and the bones. It was rubbed into sores, swallowed in draughts, applied as steam in small, hot rooms where the air grew thick and the walls dripped with condensation. The rich could afford the more elaborate treatments. They sat wrapped in linens, their skin glistening with the metallic ointment, attendants hovering nearby to dab the brow or bring a cup of watered wine. The poor received harsher measures, a crude mixture of mercury and fat smeared directly onto the skin, or a swallow from a bottle without ceremony or care for the dose. The first sensations could almost be mistaken for healing. The skin tingled, the muscles felt looser, the fever broke for a few hours. But the metal did not leave quietly. It seeped deeper, stealing strength from the hands and feet, clouding the eyes, blurring the thoughts. Teeth loosened, the gums bled. A tremor set into the fingers, sometimes so fine it could be ignored, other times so strong that a man could no longer hold a spoon. And yet, people returned to it. Some because it seemed to work, if only briefly, others because they had nothing else. In the cities, mercury could be bought in small glass bottles at the apothecary, its weight in the hand a promise of something rare. In smaller towns, it came from peddlers who rattled their carts with jars of the bright metal, their voices smooth with rehearsed assurances. The cost was steep, especially for the poor. A single treatment could equal the price of a week's food, but sickness, real or imagined, made buyers reckless. For some, it was a choice between slow suffering and the chance, however slim, that the shimmering metal might turn the tide. In time, those who used it too often began to show the same signs. A drawn look around the eyes, a strange looseness in the joints, a restlessness that never seemed to end. People whispered about the mercury walk, a light, uneven step, as if the ground itself could not be trusted. And still, the jars kept changing hands. The shine was too compelling, the promise too strong. In the flicker of a candle, a drop of mercury looked almost magical, as though it might truly carry sickness away. Perhaps it did for a time. But often, it carried the rest of the body with it. From the cool shimmer of mercury in the apothecary's jar, we turned to something warmer, a goblet of wine, rich and red, its surface catching the firelight. You lift it, and the first sip is a surprise, not the sourness of a poor harvest, but a deep, honeyed sweetness. In the Middle Ages, such perfection often came from a hidden hand. That hand was lead. Lead acetate, called sugar of lead, could make even the harshest wine taste smooth. Winemakers who lacked good grapes, or who wanted to stretch a batch beyond what the vineyard allowed, would stir the pale crystals into the cask. The change was immediate, bitterness vanished, and the drink seemed finer, more expensive. The wealthy drank it without knowing, raising their cups in bright halls, their laughter echoing off stone walls. The poor tasted it at weddings, at fairs, at those rare moments when wine was poured for them instead of ale. It was a treat, a sign of generosity from the host. Few asked how the wine had turned so sweet, fewer still cared. Lead worked quietly. There was no sudden sickness, no burning in the throat. The damage crept in over weeks, months, years. The mind grew slower, the hands unsteady, the stomach rebellious. Children who drank it, even a little, sometimes never grew quite as they should, their bodies weakened before they had begun their work in the fields. For the winemakers, it was a risk worth taking. Sweet wine sold quickly, fetched higher prices, and traveled better. Traders could carry it farther without fear that it would sour in the barrel, and buyers in distant cities were eager for the taste. The crystals were cheap, easy to mix, and left no trace to the eye once dissolved. There were whispers among the more cautious drinkers, of course. Some claimed the wine from certain regions left a heaviness in the head that no amount of water could wash away. Others noticed that the best-tasting vintages seemed to come from vineyards where the workers grew pale and thin before their time. But these were only whispers, drowned easily in the noise of feasts. Among the poor, lead-sweetened wine was rare enough to be a luxury. It might appear at a midwinter celebration, poured into mismatched cups while the music played. The sweetness made it memorable, the warmth in the belly made it welcome. Few thought of what came after, the aching joints, the sleepless nights, the fog that settled behind the eyes. And so the cups were filled and emptied, the barrels rolled from cellar to hall, the sweetened wine flowing as steadily as the years themselves. Those who drank it remembered the taste fondly, even as they forgot so much else. After the sweetness of wine turned treacherous with lead, we step into the dim, close air of an apothecary's shop, a place where jars line the shelves from floor to ceiling, their contents ranging from the familiar to the unthinkable. Here, the most expensive remedy of all is not a plant, nor a mineral, but a body. Powdered mummy was exactly what it sounded like. The ground remains of the dead, stolen from tombs in Egypt, crushed and sifted until it was fine as flour. Wrapped in paper, sold by the ounce, it was marketed as a cure for almost anything: bleeding, bruises, fever, stomach pain, even the lingering weakness after childbirth. The belief was simple, that the ancient preservation of the body had trapped some vital force within it, and consuming that force could restore your own. The rich bought it without hesitation. A merchant might keep a jar in his study, dosing himself after long travel. A noblewoman might send her servant to fetch some at the first sign of illness. It was taken stirred into wine, sprinkled on bread, mixed with honey into a dark paste. The taste was unpleasant, earthy, bitter, with a faint resin scent, but the price alone made it feel powerful. For the poor, powdered mummy was out of reach, but some apothecaries kept tiny amounts to sell in desperation. A man might trade a month's wages for a pinch to save his child, or a widow might pawn her last possession for the hope of healing. The supply chain was as grim as the product. Traders in Alexandria oversaw the robbing of tombs, breaking apart the wrappings, selecting the driest, most resin-soaked remains. From there, the bodies traveled as cargo, shipped to Venice, to Marseille, to London, before being bought up by apothecaries across Europe. The trade was so profitable that, when true mummies grew scarce, some sellers passed off recently buried bodies as ancient. baking them to dryness before grinding them down. Whether it worked was almost beside the point. Those who recovered after taking it praised the remedy. Those who didn't never had the chance to contradict them. Physicians debated its virtues, some swearing it revived the blood, others calling it a dangerous superstition. In the apothecary's shop, however, there was no debate. Only the clink of coin, the careful weighing on brass scales, the rustle of paper as the powder was folded and tied. For many, it was the closest thing to magic they would ever touch, drawn not from the earth or the sky, but from the dust of another life long gone. From the dry, resin-scented dust of the apothecary's mummy jar, the air shifts to something sharper, cleaner, though not in a comforting way. Camphor. It strikes the nose first, a sudden cold that seems to clear the head and sting the eyes at the same time. Drawn from the wood of distant trees, camphor traveled almost as far as the mummies did, but it was meant for the living alone. Apothecaries kept it in tightly sealed boxes or glass jars, the white crystals giving off a constant vapor that could fill an entire room with its peculiar chill. It was prescribed for the weak, those whose breath came shallow, whose chests rattled at night, whose strength seemed to slip away with each passing day. The method was simple. Crush the camphor, place it in boiling water, and lean over the rising vapors, a cloth draped overhead and bowl to trap the sharp scent. The first breath shocked the lungs, the second seemed to open them, and the third made the heart beat faster, as if startled into remembering its work. For the rich, camphor inhalations were done in private chambers, with polished brass kettles and attendants to adjust the water's heat. For the poor, it was often improvised, a cracked earthen pot, a borrowed blanket, steam rising in the corner of a single-room home. People swore it revived them, at least for a while. A man bedridden in the morning might be sitting up by evening. A woman too tired to stand could walk across the room. But the relief was fickle. Too much camphor, and the head spun, the stomach heaved, the body shivered as if gripped by sudden fever. In some cases, the breath it was meant to save slowed instead, the chest rising less and less until it stilled. It was also worn, sewn into small cloth pouches hung around the neck or tucked under pillows, meant to keep bad air at bay. In crowded cities, the smell of camphor mingled with the tang of vinegar and smoke from burning herbs, a public defense against sickness that crept in unseen. Children hated it, wrinkling their noses and turning their heads, but mothers pressed it close anyway, whispering that its sharpness was a sign of strength. The dying sometimes asked for it in their final hours, not for healing, but for the sensation, that cold, biting breath that cut through the fog for a moment, enough to see the faces at the bedside more clearly. Camphor never promised a cure, only a chance. And in a world where so many remedies were slower, darker, heavier, its sudden rush of cold felt almost like life itself returning, even if only for a few borrowed hours. From the sharp, clean bite of camphor vapors, the air turns heavier, darker, a weight that clings to the tongue and burns the throat. Sulfur. Its yellow chunks looked harmless enough, like lumps of pale beeswax, but once set to flame, they filled the room with a stinging, choking smoke that curled into every corner. It was burned to drive out bad air, the unseen enemy blamed for sickness. The ritual was simple in form, brutal in effect. A brazier was set in the center of the room, the sulfur piled on and lit until it caught with a sputtering flame. Doors and shutters were closed tight. The smoke rolled out in thick waves, filling the space with the smell of struck matches and something deeper, the scent of the earth's own breath, dragged up from far below. In wealthy homes, servants did the burning, moving from chamber to chamber while the family waited outside, scarves pressed to their faces. In poorer homes, the inhabitants stayed put, huddled near the floor where the smoke was thinnest, coughing and blinking against the sting, praying that whatever illness haunted the air would be chased away before their lungs gave out. The theory was that sulphur's foulness would overpower any miasma, that the very stench could cleanse. Midwives used it after attending a birth in a home where fever had struck. Innkeepers burned it in guest rooms between lodgers, hoping to keep travelers' sickness from spreading. Sailors smoked the holds of ships before long voyages, believing it kept plague from taking root. The burning left a mark. Curtains and clothing took on its reek, a scent that no washing could fully remove. The walls seemed to sweat with it, and even weeks later, a sudden rain could bring the smell back to life. Children cried when it was lit, animals had to be driven out into the street. Some people swore they could feel it working, a strange clearing of the head after the worst of the coughing passed. Others said it only made them weaker, leaving their chests raw and their throats sore for days. Yet sulphur remained, year after year, a constant in times of outbreak. It was cheap, easy to store, and, perhaps most importantly, it made people feel they were doing something, taking action against a threat they couldn't see. And sometimes, belief was as much a part of the cure as anything else. From the open burning of sulphur in the hearth, meant to drive sickness into the night air, we moved to a quieter kind of smoke, not rising from a brazier, but curling from a small clay cup. The steam is scented not with one thing, but with many: pennyroyal, rue, parsley, tansy. Their smells mingle, sharp, green, bitter, with a faint sweetness that sits uneasily on the tongue. These teas were brewed in whispers, away from the public eye. The work began with gathering, sometimes openly, as if for cooking, sometimes in secret, snipping leaves in the early morning when no one watched the garden. The herbs were dried, crushed, or used fresh, steeped in water so hot it hissed when poured. A woman might drink them alone, or in the company of one trusted friend. The reasons varied: poverty, fear, shame, a husband away at sea, a lover who had turned his back, another mouth to feed when the table was already bare. In some cases, the choice was not the woman's at all, but the will of a parent, an employer, or the mistress of the house. The first sips could bring only a warmth in the stomach, a slight restlessness in the limbs. Then the cramps would begin, a tightening low in the belly, growing sharper with each hour. Some women bled within the day, others endured days of pain before the bleeding came. And for some, it never came at all, the herbs failing in their purpose, leaving the woman weakened but still carrying the child. The danger was ever present. Pennyroyal, taken in large amounts, could turn the skin yellow and stop the breath. Rue could seize the muscles so violently that the body could not recover. Parsley seemed gentle, but in high doses it could burn the throat and bring fever. The line between remedy and poison was thin, and crossing it was easy. Among the rich, such teas were sometimes prepared by skilled hands, their doses measured, their ingredients chosen with care. Among the poor, they were often brewed in desperation, with handfuls rather than pinches, in cups that were drained quickly, the bitterness chased with beer or bread. No one spoke of it openly. A neighbor might notice the scent of rue on the air and glance away. A healer might leave a bundle of pennyroyal on a doorstep without knocking. The act was at once common and forbidden, a knowledge passed quietly from woman to woman, carried in memory more than in writing. For some, the tea did what was asked and left only the ache of loss. For others, it brought not only an end to a pregnancy, but to life itself. The burial of a young woman could be explained as fever, or as the will of God, and the herbs in her home left unmentioned. And still, the brewing continued. In kitchens, in back rooms, in the corners of gardens where the strongest plants grew. Because in a world that offered women so few choices, the bitter cup was one of the few they could raise themselves. From the shadowed corner where bitter teas brewed in secret, we step into the bright, glinting promise of alchemists' tables. Here, glass flasks catch the candlelight, and powders shimmer like crushed stars. Gold, pounded so fine it drifts in the air like dust, and antimony, dark and metallic, lie side by side. Together they were said to do the impossible, lengthen a life beyond its natural measure. The idea was as old as kings, that gold, incorruptible and pure, could pass its perfection into the body. Antimony, its strange companion, was believed to purge the flesh of decay, to scour away sickness as a brush scours a pan. Mixed in precise proportions, dissolved in wine or infused into honey, these substances became the elixirs, that noble sipped slowly, eyes half closed as if tasting the edge of immortality. In the courts of the wealthy, the drinking of such mixtures was a ritual. An alchemist, robed and careful, would present the goblet with both hands. The liquid inside caught the light, flecked with motes that swirled when stirred, a miniature universe in the cup. One sip, sometimes two. Never more in a single sitting, for even the most confident drinkers knew that the line between medicine and poison was perilously thin. The cost was beyond imagining for common folk. A single draught might equal the value of a farmer's land, and the ingredients themselves came from the ends of the earth. Gold from riverbeds claimed by empires, antimony from mines guarded like fortresses. For the rich, that price was part of the magic. It was proof that they could command not only wealth, but time itself. The poor saw these elixirs rarely, and then only in stories. A merchant who returned from distant lands looking untouched by years, a lord whose hair stayed black long after his brothers had turned white. Whether these tales were truth or invention, they carried a certain weight. People wanted to believe that somewhere, a man or woman had found the way to outwit the years. But the truth was less kind. Antimony, taken too often, thinned the body and unsettled the heart. Gold, though beautiful, was heavy on the organs, leaving the liver and kidneys struggling under its weight. Some drinkers grew paler over time, their eyes shadowed, their hands trembling as if the years they had tried to push away had come back all at once, demanding payment. Yet belief is a stubborn thing. So long as there were alchemists willing to sell the dream, and buyers willing to pay, the bright dust of gold would keep swirling in those cups. In the quiet after a banquet, a noble might sit alone, turning the goblet in his hand, watching the motes drift slowly through the liquid, as if he could see his own life suspended there, golden, untouchable, eternal. From the gleam of gold swirling in a goblet, we moved to a darker glass, heavier in the hand, its contents the color of polished mahogany. Laudanum, opium dissolved in fine wine, had none of the glittering spectacle of the alchemist's elixirs. It didn't promise to stretch the years ahead, it simply softened the hours you had left. Among the wealthy, it was the drink of late evenings, taken not in public halls but in private chambers, behind doors closed to all but the most trusted servants. A small measure was poured into a crystal glass, held for a moment to the lamplight as if to judge its depth, then sipped slowly, the bitterness of the opium wrapped in the warmth of the wine. For some it was medicine, a way to ease the pain of old injuries, to calm the coughing fits of winter, to coax sleep into coming. For others, it was simply habit, a nightly ritual as fixed as prayer or the locking of the doors. Its effects came gently at first. The body loosened, the mind drifted, the weight of the day's thoughts lightened until they seemed as harmless as dust in a sunbeam. But with time, the boundary between relief and need blurred. The same hand that once poured a few drops began to pour more, until the nightcap filled half the glass, then more still. The rich could afford this indulgence for years, the apothecaries always ready to refill their stoppered bottles. Servants learned the exact way their masters liked it, warmed by the fire in winter, cooled with a splash of water in summer. Guests might be offered a taste after a long journey, the unspoken message being that here, in this house, comfort was never in short supply. The poor rarely touched laudanum in its fine form. What they found, if at all, was the cheaper tincture sold in dark bottles at the market, bitter and unsoftened by wine, taken in larger gulps to dull the same aches, the same griefs. For them, it was not a nightcap but a desperate measure. Among the wealthy, however, laudanum had a certain dignity. It was a luxury that left no stain on the lips, no fumes on the breath. A man could take it before bed and greet the morning with clear eyes, though perhaps slower steps. A woman could keep it in a locked cabinet, knowing that the small, amber bottle held the promise of quiet, of rest, of a night without pain or restless thoughts. Yet beneath its polished surface lay the same truth that haunted all such remedies. The comfort it gave was borrowed, and the debt always came due. Some drinkers found they could no longer sleep without it, others, that they could no longer pass a day without longing for the night when the glass would be filled again. Still, in the hush of a noble's chamber, with the fire low and the world outside already forgotten, the last swallow of laudanum felt like the closing of a heavy door, shutting out every worry, every pain, leaving only the slow, warm drift toward dreams.